What's up, YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and free agency is right around the corner. The 2019 free agency class is easily one of the most impressive ones that we've seen in quite some time. The amount of players that are available to multiple teams is almost unheard of, and the amount of money that teams have set aside for this summer will easily make it one of the more entertaining off seasons that we've seen possibly since 2016. And with there being so much information that I have to pass on to you all before we even get to my predictions on where I expect some of these players to go this summer, let's just go ahead and get right into this video, because this video is definitely going to have a lot of information thrown at you. Now, possibly one of the most consistent questions that I've heard throughout my timeline and even through my comment section is, why is it that this year's offseason will be so monumental? And that's because roughly 40%, which I know sounds ridiculous, but it is true, roughly 40% of NBA players this year will be free agents of some sort, unrestricted, restricted, or possibly having a team or player option. Now, because there's going to be so many free agents, just naturally speaking, we should expect a lot of player movement. But there's also a couple of other things that people need to anticipate and expect this upcoming offseason I think a lot of people are overlooking. For example, how much money that each team has to spend, because if there's going to be a lot of players that will be available, that means that there's going to be a lot of players that are not signed to certain teams, meaning that there should be a lot of teams who have freed up cap, and that would be true. Now, when it comes to this graphic, let me be completely transparent and tell you that a lot of these numbers are just really rough estimates. And as we clearly have just seen with the Lakers, within one or two transactions, you can free up somewhere between $5 to $7 million fairly easy. Some teams could even clear up even more money than that. But at the end of the day, I think the one thing that you can get away from this graphic is that there's basically 10 teams in the NBA who have freed up roughly around $30+ million in cap space, basically meaning that a third of the teams in the NBA could basically sign a max contract player this upcoming offseason. Granted, I don't believe a team like the New Orleans Pelicans or even the Indiana Pacers will do so, but it does mean that they have the option if the opportunity strikes. But in my opinion, what's most important is that even if you don't sign a max contract player, $30 million is a lot for any team, especially those who are competing for a championship or even a playoff spot to fill out their roster with. So teams like the Philadelphia 76ers, Boston Celtics, and of course the Los Angeles Lakers are set to make some major moves this upcoming offseason, even if it means they don't sign a max contract player. Now, another thing that I think a lot of people are overlooking are some of the teams that may have a hard time retaining all of the players that they had last year, or even worse, possibly making some drastic changes to their lineups and rotations, or even adding some depth or dynamic players to their team. A great example of this is the Milwaukee Bucks and how they only have $17 million in cap space, even though Malcolm Brogdon, Chris Middleton, and Brook Lopez are all free agents. Granted, they do have Brogdon and Middleton's bird rights, so they will be able to go over the cap, but again, it still will be very interesting to see how a small market maneuvers financially for the next handful of seasons, because the last time we saw a team on the brink of winning a championship and they made a decision heavily based off of cap space, we saw James Harden wearing a Houston Rockets jersey for practically the remainder of his career. So we'll figure out what exactly we're going to see in Milwaukee. But what's even more interesting is what exactly are teams like the Houston Rockets, Portland Trail Blazers, and the Oklahoma City Thunder are going to do moving forward. Since all three of those teams are pretty consistently in the playoffs, but it doesn't really feel like they've made any massive strides in the right direction when it comes to competing for a championship. But financially speaking, they are well over the cap, so they don't really have that much wiggle room, and all three of those teams have been rumored to potentially trade some players, most noticeably when it comes to the Oklahoma City Thunder and looking to trade off Andre Roberson and Steven Adams. And then when it comes to Houston, Clint Capella and allegedly Chris Paul have been on the trading block, which to me just makes the most sense because Chris Paul's contract is quite ridiculous. But again, I think this graphic does a really good job in explaining what exactly you should expect from your team when it comes to cap space in the upcoming weeks. Again, things can change, but if you do want this graphic, I did upload it on my timeline, and I will upload it on my community page and update it consistently, so be on the lookout for that. Now, the next thing that I think people are concerned about is how much is max money? Now, this isn't a simple question, even though I'm more likely going to give you a simple answer, but in short, when it comes to a max contract, there are 3 variables that you have to keep in mind. How long a player has been in the NBA, if a player is going to stay or leave, and if that team has that player's bird rights. But what's most important, and possibly what everyone is looking for, is what you see on the far right hand side when it comes to what exactly will their salary be for this upcoming season. And those numbers break down somewhere between $27 million all the way to $38 million. So again, there are a lot of variations when it comes to these numbers, but what's most important is the player that you were referring to and really how long he's been in the NBA, since a max contract is heavily dependent on the experience that the player has in the league. Now, when it comes to a supermax contract, I'm not going to spend that much time on it because Kemba Walker is really the only player who would even apply for a supermax this upcoming offseason, as he's been able to check off all of the boxes. But just for everyone to get an understanding of how much money Kemba Walker will be walking away from if he decides to sign with a new team, on a supermax, Kemba Walker would receive a 5-year, $221 million contract. If he decides to stay with the Charlotte Hornets but not take a supermax, just take a regular max with his bird rights, then he will receive a 5-year, $190 million contract. But if he decides to go to another team, we're talking about a 4-year, $140 million contract. Basically meaning, in short, Kemba Walker, if he were to join with the Boston Celtics, he would be leaving roughly $80 million on the table, which is a ridiculous amount of money. But of course, that's the whole purpose of a supermax, to incentivize players to stay on the team that they were drafted on. The next question is, where do I believe a lot of these top tier players are going to go? Now, I'm not an NBA insider, but some of these predictions do stem from what I've read from different articles, tweets of very well-known NBA insiders and people who just have some type of communication with some NBA players and their inner circles. So some of these guesses are educated guesses. Others, such as what Kawhi is going to do, is basically a shot in the dark because that's what everybody is doing at this moment. And actually, speaking of Kawhi, we can just start off with him. Kawhi Leonard this year, in my opinion, goes into this year's free agency season as the best player available since Kevin Durant suffered his torn Achilles. And with Kawhi Leonard being the best player in this year's free agency class, that does mean he holds a lot of power. And depending on which team that he decides to go to, that could potentially mean that we will have another title contender in the NBA. And because Kawhi Leonard is just really that good, there have been a lot of teams who have freed up the cap space to add him to their roster, most notably, obviously, the Los Angeles Lakers. But in my opinion, the 2 teams that are a bit more realistic for Kawhi Leonard to sign to are either the Los Angeles Clippers or the Toronto Raptors. And if I had to lean one way or the other, I actually believe that he's going to stay. In Toronto, they have built something very, very unique that I really don't believe Kawhi could find anywhere else unless he possibly signs with the Lakers, but to me that's a bit of a stretch, even though they have freed up enough cap to sign him. Next up, we have Kevin Durant, and when it comes to KD, when he tore his Achilles, that really changed a lot of things when it comes to this year's free agency and what should we expect from not only him but other players who potentially could join him on another team. But now I do believe there should be some pause and hesitation to giving Kevin Durant that type of money, especially since he's 30 years old and coming off of arguably the worst injury in all of sports. But there are still some teams who may be desperate to throw some money his way. For example, the New York Knicks are possibly at the top of that list, but even the Nets, it comes across as if like they're willing to take that type of a risk. So when it comes to Kevin Durant and where I believe he's going to go, I think it heavily depends on who's going to join him. But in my opinion, the Nets should be at the top of the list, and I do believe that he will leave. If not, I do believe that the Knicks are second on the list because I do believe that they are, without a doubt, willing to throw the money at him. It's just that if I were Kevin Durant, I would choose the Nets over the Knicks because that's just a better ran organization. Next up, we have Kyrie. I think this is fairly simple. He's not staying in Boston. A relationship that he had with the organization really soured as the season continues to progress, and him no longer being a Celtic seems more fitting than anything else. But the team he's going to go to, I believe, is going to lean more so towards the Nets, more so than anything else, especially if he can get either Jimmy Butler or Kevin Durant to join him. If he doesn't go to the Nets, then I feel like he's going to go to the Knicks. But again, that's heavily implied that another star will join him in New York. After that, we have Kemba Walker. Again, very interesting to see what's going to happen with Kemba and Charlotte, because if we're going to be honest with ourselves, even though, yes, Kemba has qualified for a Supermax, let's just call a spade, he's not really a Supermax contract player. He does not provide enough impact to justify anybody spending that much money on Kemba Walker. Now, there has been rumors that Kemba is completely fine with not receiving a Supermax because I think he understands the financial implication that comes with signing that type of a contract. But like I stated before, there's basically an $80 million gap between him going to another team and him signing a Supermax contract. So basically, there's a lot of negotiation room between point A and point Z. So who knows where they're going to land on. But honestly, if I'm Kemba, I'm going to another team because financially speaking, even without Kemba and Jeremy Lamb on the roster, the Charlotte Hornets really don't have that much wiggle room. So by the time they add both of those players on the team, you're basically going into the next season with the exact same roster you had this year. In too many years, time after time, Charlotte has basically proven that they're not willing to spend the money that is necessary to win a championship or even make the playoffs. So I'm done with Charlotte if I am Kemba, which is why I believe that he's going to go to either New York or the Clippers. I think a tandem between Kemba and Kawhi in LA is very interesting and is something that people should not overlook. Next up, we have Jimmy Butler, and even though I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, very similar to Kemba, I don't really think Jimmy is a max contract player. I don't believe he gives you enough impact to justify him receiving the same amount of money as Kawhi Leonard or even Kyrie Irving. Granted, this last postseason, he was really good and easily the most consistent player in Philly, but personally, I just don't feel like he checks off enough boxes for him to be, again, compensated like Kawhi Leonard. But when it comes to Jimmy Butler, luckily for him, just because there's so many teams out there with a lot of cap space, I do believe he will receive max money, and I do believe that one of those teams who was willing to give him a max are the Philadelphia 76ers, as they gave up a lot of assets to get Jimmy Butler. So I don't believe they're just going to allow him to walk in, even if that means giving him a max contract, then I do believe they will do so. Next, we have Klay Thompson, and I'm going to keep this short and simple. He's going to stay, even though he's coming off from a very serious injury. It is an injury that he should be able to come back from by December, no later than January. So I don't really think it's going to be that big of an issue. But to me, it just does not make any sense whatsoever for Golden State to allow him to just walk and receive nothing in return. And as long as they give him a max, I believe that Klay Thompson is open to just re-signing with the Golden State Warriors. And the Warriors are probably at the top of his list anyway. So if they give him a max, which I'm pretty sure they will, I have Klay Thompson staying. Next up, we have D'Angelo Russell. Now, D'Lo, technically speaking, is a restricted free agent, but thanks to the Brooklyn Nets potentially signing some other veterans, which basically means that there's going to be a lot of teams out there who have the opportunity to sign D'Lo to a fairly reasonable contract, even if he receives a max. The most noticeable one are the Phoenix Suns, as they freed up a lot of cap the days leading up into the draft and even during draft night itself. But the other team that I really like for D'Lo are the Indiana Pacers, and I feel like having a backcourt with both Victor Oladipo and D'Lo, that sounds a little bit better just because defensively, Victor Oladipo gives you more than what you're going to get out of Devin Booker, and both Oladipo and D'Angelo Russell can operate off ball, and I also feel like both of them could feed off of one another better than D'Lo and Devin Booker. So those are my predictions, as well as some information when it comes to this year's free agency class. Let me know what you think about what your team should do in the comment section below. And until next time, I will see you all later. Peace.